Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. This episode of the GardenDC podcast, we're joined by Stanton Gill. He is the co-owner and CFO of MacBride and Gill Falcon Ridge Fruit Orchard since 2002, where he grows over 22 acres of fruits and 103 cultivars of apples. Since 1995, he's been a tenured professor with Montgomery College, Germantown campus in the Landscape Tech program. He teaches at night in this accredited program. And he is a tenured faculty member of the University of Maryland Extension, working as the state IPM and Entomology specialist stationed at Central Maryland Research and Education Center. As an extension specialist, do you have any free time, Stanton?
No, absolutely not.
So let's dive into all things persimmon growing is going to be our main topic, but then we're going to also talk about some other unusual fruit trees we can grow in the mid-Atlantic. But before we go into all that, Stanton, we like to ask people on the GardenDC podcast, were they born with a green thumb and chlorophyll in their veins?
I don't think I was born with a green thumb by any means. I did come from a orchard family. My great-grandfather in Pennsylvania ran an orchard out in an area called Loretta. It's just outside of Altoona, Pennsylvania. My grandfather, when he married my grandmother, inherited that orchard, and he spent all of his time cutting those trees down because at that point he said no one made money on fruit trees at that time, and they made money on liquor, and so he grew vegetables that make liquor, believe it or not.
Yeah. So he wasn't into the hard cider then?
At that point, they were making hard liquor to keep his family alive during the Depression, he tells me. So, yeah, not hard cider, though. They didn't make that.
We're going to have to maybe have another discussion another time about how to make hard liquor from vegetables.
Yeah.
And I'm imagining one of those might be potatoes.
It was potatoes. They did it back in the woods, and they did the moonlight thing where they take it into town by a full moon so they could skip the revenuers. Yeah.
So when did you discover a love of horticulture?
In college, like most people in biology, I was a pre-med major, and then I took a horticulture class and fell in love with horticulture. And that's what my undergraduate degree was in. And I took a fruit class, and actually what I fell in love with was not persimmons, but it was seedless grapes. And that was my first introduction into fruit growing, was growing seedless grapes.
And were you just growing them for yourself, or were you growing them at your family's property?
Well, when I was in college, it was a course in living in an apartment. So I asked my parents if I could put grapes at their place in Silver Spring, Maryland. And they said, while you're in college, you can have it there. As soon as you get out of there for undergraduate, take it with you. So I took cuttings off my grapevines and I would root them every year and put them in little 3-gallon pots. And when I met my now wife, I had probably about 4 or 5 seedless grapes in pots. And where most people have houseplants out on their little balcony, we had potted grapevines. My friends used to laugh at me, and they said, "What are you doing with those?" And I said, "I'd reroot them every year." And I told them, "Someday I will own a farm." And again, they laughed at me. But now I own 4 farms, and we put it together into 105 acres up in Westminster. They're all adjacent to each other, and it's a beautiful operation. Looks like a big experiment station.
Nice. So aside from the grapes, and we'll probably get into some other unusual things to grow for the Mid-Atlantic today.
Oh, yeah.
You are known locally as the Persimmon Guy. That's how I know you from local farmers markets. So now is the height of persimmon season?
It is. We've moved into persimmon season,
Mm-hmm.
and I like having being called the persimmon man. I mean, whatever we're selling, we're that for that week. You know, the apple person, the peach person. So now I'm a persimmon guy, I guess. And actually, I'm an entomologist, so I get to be all these wear all these caps. But as far as moving into it, yes. As it gets into the cooler weather, the persimmons, Diosporus, really start to get their flavor to them, especially the Oriental types. The native persimmon really won't come into its own until we've had several hard frosts. Then it'll probably be almost Thanksgiving or a little later before that really is edible because of the tannins they have to break down with that cold weather.
Hmm. So let's get into that a little bit since we're talking about the differences between the native and the Asian varieties. So you said there's tannins that need to be broken down with the cold. So that's different from how other edibles in the garden, we let them be exposed to frost so that the sugars can develop, say like in
Yeah.
peas.
hmm
So that's not the case for persimmons. They don't develop sugars in them.
Well, they do develop sugars, but the tannin really does have to break down. The If you bite into a persimmon before these tannins have broken down, it's what we call astringent. Otherwise, it tastes like biting into a hunk of chalk. You'll pucker up your mouth when
Mm.
you bite into that. But when it's had several very hard freezes on the native ones, it breaks all those tannins down, and then you the sugars are developing in there. It's just the tannins covering a lot of those up. So then you're getting the sweetness out of it. But at that point, it's a pretty puckery looking little piece of fruit on the native ones. It's rather wrinkled and not overly attractive. Let me put it that way. So, um, but it's still very tasty, and it's good for puddings, pies, jams, and that sort of thing when it's at that state.
Hmm. That's a great point, Stanton, that the native one, they're both beautiful trees, the
Oh yeah.
Asian or the native ones, but the native fruit is not as beautiful as those beautiful Asian persimmons you find at the market. It's kind of like it looks like it's been bruised up. I guess you could say that it's fallen on the ground. And is it true that you have to wait till the native ones have fallen to the ground?
Well, they don't have to fall to the ground, but but if you do have deer in the area and they do fall to the ground, you're going to be a giant magnet for deer populations and raccoons and possum and everything else. Everything loves those things. It's like candy falling to the ground. If you do you can get them when they fall to the ground, no doubt about it. But you better be quick about it because those animals will find it. Generally, the ones we have up at the farm will go up a ladder and you can feel them. They're just before they're going to drop. We try and get them off the tree. One, because you don't have the animals feeding on them, obviously. But the other thing is you have all sorts of dirt get on it when it falls into the ground, and it's kind of a loose piece of fruit right then. You're going to get all sorts of things embedded in there. So it'd be better to take it off the tree, but you're going to have to taste it on that tree before you start harvesting them. And you had to go through several very hard freezes, not these light ones that we had this last week.
Hmm. And so once they're ripe, they
Mhm.
don't ripen anymore once you pick them, I mean.
Well, the as far as the sweetness,
Hmm.
pretty much. I mean, they will sweeten a little bit. They'll go to a point, and then after that, then they begin to decompose. So we have picked them and then held them, and we usually will put them in a cooler when they do that. And we can hold them usually about 3 or 4 weeks in a cooler. You could stick it in your refrigerator and do that too. And they will soften a little more and get a little sweeter. But then they reach a point, and then they go from sweetness into just kind of a decomposing state.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And that's probably another major difference between our Native American persimmons and the Asian ones is that the Asian ones seem to be much longer storing.
hmm Well, there's different types of Asian ones too. There are certain varieties of Asian that are called non-astringent. So otherwise, they're not high in the tannins. Um,
Hmm.
and but there are Asian types that are astringent, just like the American ones. And the in Japan and China, some people prefer astringent types. Believe it or not, they will wait until they have hard frost, and in some cases, they will take the fruit, harvest those astringent types, and they put it in a freezer. And they've worked out how long to do that for, and it breaks down the tannins, and then they'll pull it out and they say those are sweeter than the ones that are firm, the non-astringent. Now, but personally, I prefer the non-astringent types because, like you're describing, you can harvest them when they're firm. They usually turn a yellow-orange color, and they're very nice and sweet. They have more of a flavor I attribute closer to an apricot, at least for me.
Hmm. That does bring up the flavor differences.
Yeah.
So maybe we can talk about how a native is as opposed to a few of the different varieties of the Asian one.
hmm Well, the native again, you're eating when it's a softer piece of fruit, so it's not going to be that firm. Well, you wouldn't be able to get it down if it was firm, but once it's softened, then it's more almost like a marmalade jelly. Um, it is very, very sweet, and it is very nice, very delightful if you get it after those tannins are broken down. But say the Oriental types, like the one that we grow is called Guang Yang, and that's from a district in Korea. Be like saying Montgomery County or Prince George's County. It's a region of Korea that's just south of Seoul, and that one was introduced to me by Dr. Bill Preston, and I can't really claim to be the persimmon man. I mean, if anybody was the persimmon man, it was Dr. Preston. Him and Dr. Shanks from the University of Maryland traveled over to the Orient, evidently back in the 1960s period, is what they tell me, and they collected persimmons from China, all parts of Japan, southern, middle, and northern, and they collected them from Korea, and they brought them back to USDA Beltsville and planted all these Oriental persimmons in a big plot, and they evaluated them over years, and they were seeing which ones were sweetest. But the big thing they were checking for was which ones were hardy for growing
Hmm.
here in Maryland. And of all the varieties they tested, um, they found Guangyang, the one from Korea, was a non-astringent type. It had a beautiful color, a nice shape, looks like a kind of a squatty tomato, and it was the most winter hardy of all the varieties. And Dr. Preston wrote a book called The Persimmon, and you can find that if you do searches for it. He honored me by signing a copy, and so I have one of the rare signed copies. Bill passed away about 4 years ago, but he had a family farm down in Calvert County where they had a rather extensive planting of Oriental persimmons, and he would sell them for years or harvest them. And after he retired from USDA in the 1990s, he would sell at the Tacoma Park Market, and he was known as the Persimmon Man.
Hmm.
And um, he had the Guangyang, and he had one or two other varieties he grew that were winter hardy that did very nicely down in Calvert County.
Nice. And do you know if any of his trees survived or were passed on to anyone?
Well, the it was a family farm, so he had brothers and sisters, and they before Bill passed away, they sold it, and a couple bought it that were actually real estate agents. They were investors, and they harvested the fruit in the first year and sold it and did very well because the fruit sells for around $4 a pound, and you can get so at least maybe 150 pounds off a tree. So they did very well out of it, but then they found out about all the work involved with pruning, shaping, and everything else, and they realized they didn't know much about fruit. So they sold it to a young couple, and I believe that young couple is still selling at Tacoma Park Market. And these are trees that Bill Preston installed years ago.
Hmm. Yeah, I do see them come to Tacoma Park, sorry,
Mm-hmm.
Market under Preston Persimmons, and you
Oh, is
can,
that what they're calling them?
yeah, and you can find them on social media too, and they only do that one variety of
Yes.
persimmons, so that's great.
It was one of the things that Bill taught me over the years was, and he became a very good friend. He taught me how to graft the trees, and he was very patient with me because it's one of the harder trees I've had to graft and have a take out of it. It seems to be rather difficult to do. But he said two things I'm going to teach you. One, only grow this variety, and he said the other thing is this is the only variety I can tell you that is truly winter hardy here. And so at first in my orchard, I stayed true to Bill's wise words and only grew Guang Yang. Years later, my job with as an entomologist worked with the nursery and greenhouse industry. one of our nurserymen started growing other varieties of persimmon in Frederick, and he would sell the trees to landscapers. And I told him, well, Guang Yang's the only hardy one here. Well, we had a stretch of very warm winters for about 7 in a row, and he said, oh no, you can grow these other varieties, they're hardy here. So I put in an order with him for some of these other varieties and thought, well, let's expand out and try some other ones. What happened was they grew well for about 2 years. Then we had something come through called the polar vortex. If you remember, about maybe 12 years ago, we had an extreme cold period that blew down from the
Mm-hmm.
north. It
Yep.
went down to 8 below. Then about 3 years later, we had something called the polar express that came through. And this is all involved with the climate change. We're getting more violent weather. Both of those cold periods killed all those other varieties in that nursery, and they killed the trees I planted up in my farm, except for Guang Yang. Guang Yang came through. The other thing that he had taught me was on you just grow Guang Yang, one because it's winter hardy, but the tree is self-fertile, and when you just put that one variety out, it will be virtually seedless if you just grow Guang Yang. If you put in another variety, then pollen can come from the other variety, and you'll start to see seed develop in that one and the other variety that you planted. So you get little seeds inside. So at least I kept mine separate from the Guang Yang, and that's worked very well. So if you pick an Oriental persimmon, when you're looking your catalogs or looking online, I would suggest Guang Yang. But if you pick another variety, the Giro does well here too. Stark sells a good one that's pretty hardy. But just pick that one variety, or at least plant it in one area and don't have it near the other one that it can pollinate, because otherwise you'll get seed production inside there. And really, it's better to have a piece of fruit that's seedless.
And when you say not in the same area, is that 20 yards apart? How far?
Yeah, it really has to do with the wind and the pollinators as far as they would go.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about a residential yard, I wouldn't put another one in your yard and ask your neighbors. Don't get your neighbors to start growing nearby. But if you're a couple of neighborhoods away, then you'd be fine. The chance of the pollinator carrying that in or the wind carrying it in would be rather slim. Yeah,
Would they cross with a native persimmon that might be nearby?
they can.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, in fact, there's some hybrids they have. If you look on the market, that have advertised where they've crossed the native persimmon, uh, native to North America, with the Oriental types. They have one they crossed in the Ukraine that they call Nikita's Gift, and that's a cross of Oriental type and another diaspora, not the American one, but one native to the Ukraine. They cross those two, and they have a hybrid between them. And then if you look in the catalogs, they'll have things like there's one called Meters Delight, and Meters Delight is a cross of an American persimmon, native persimmon, with the one of the Oriental types. So yes, they can cross pollinate. Not that the fruit would be any different on that tree. It's the seed you just produce seed, and there's what's going to happen out of that. And then if you took the seed and grew that up, then it would be a hybrid between those two plants.
And getting back to that hard work you talked about earlier for the next generation taking on an orchard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so let's talk about some of that maintenance for the persimmon trees. What do
Mm-hmm.
you start off? Maybe we'll go through a calendar year. So,
Sure.
do we do anything January through March?
Not really. You can plant a Oriental persimmon into the fall here. In fact, I have four that are coming this next week that I'll be installing in early November. It's just you have to work in a lot of compost into the soil and make sure it's a very good fertile soil. pH usually between 5.6 to 6.3, somewhere in that range. It's slightly acidic. It's not as particular as some of the other fruit trees like an apple would be or peach, that just has to have a higher pH. But prep the soil and have it all growing. That's it. Now, as far as the pruning, generally I don't do pruning until we've gone through the cold part of the winter, and that would be usually February here. Sometimes it's early March. And the reason you're waiting off on that is if you have any cold injury to the wood, you could see that as you move into the end of February, early March, and you can prune out that damaged wood. If you have varieties that are, if you're not going to use the Guang Yang, use one of these other varieties, and you can grow some of these other ones if you're in a city area like down in the lower part of Montgomery County or closer to DC, you've got microenvironments there, so it's a little bit warmer. Where my orchard is, we're up in Westminster, and we're at 1,000-foot elevation, so it gets colder there. So I wouldn't fool with these other varieties. But the Guangyang, I usually don't see the winter damage there. Now, going back to as far as the pruning, so say you establish in the spring or you establish in the fall, you're just going to basically let it grow for the first 2 or 3 years. There isn't a whole lot of maintenance to an Oriental persimmon in the beginning. Basically, you want as many leaves coming out there to expand the trunk and branches. You might do some slight pruning in March for branches that are very sharp angled if they're coming up. You want branches to spread out. Generally, I'll let them have a central leader to the tree, and we'll go up to about maybe 5 or 6 feet on that central leader. Then we'll try and develop scaffold branches going outward. That's to bear the weight. The tree is not a huge tree if you just let it go, it's only going to get around. The Guangyang is usually going to top out at about 12 feet in height. If you want to keep it smaller, you certainly can prune them for that, and that's generally what we do in our orchard. Is most of our fruit trees we will prune to keep it down at usually under 8 feet. You're going to get more bearing the bigger the tree if you let it go up 12 feet, but keep in mind you're going to have to go up a ladder to harvest that fruit. And when you harvest a persimmon, the Oriental types, and even the native ones, they tend to hold the calyx, which is the base of where the fruit is. After the flowers on there, they have the calyx there. It looks like a cap, and it's attached to the fruit. If you try and pull it, it usually will wound the top of that fruit. You'll open it up, so now it's going to break down. Usually we'll take pruning shears up and actually cut the little small branch and then come back and then cut in close to that. Leave the calyx intact when they're selling it. And then as it matures, you can easily pull that cap out of there when you're going to go to eat it. But you leave that calyx cap on there.
And so for continued pruning throughout the season,
Mm-hmm.
do you do it to thin the fruits at all, like you would on an apple tree, or do you leave it alone?
We have just let ours bear.
Mm-hmm.
If you thin a fruit, what you're going to get is the remaining fruit's going to be bigger. But we found a lot of times when we don't thin ours, we get something that is maybe around, if you have a fair amount of rain, you're going to get something that'd be about 3 inches across, and it's about 1.5 inches high. For the market we sell in, for farmers market, that size seems to fit most people's needs. If you thinned it, yeah, you'd get bigger fruit. But a lot of times people look at things and they get too big. They say, well, that's too much fruit for me to handle, which you might find it peculiar to hear that, but we hear that very commonly at our farm
Mm-hmm.
market. So we don't thin is what it gets down to on the Oriental persimmons. It's not dense like a peach tree or a plum on the fruit set on that. They tend to space themselves out on there. Sometimes you might have one on either side, but usually you have at least several inches in between the fruit. So it does a pretty nice job of spacing itself out without having to thin those. It is an extremely attractive tree at this time of year. When that fruit is starting to show the yellow color and then turning that orange, even if you weren't going to harvest the fruit, it's just spectacular looking.
Yeah, I agree, Stanton. I think it's a beautiful landscape tree, even
Mm-hmm.
if you never get one fruit from it.
Yeah,
And that can probably bring us around to, everybody else likes to eat persimmons, as you mentioned before.
right.
So, what do you do to stop the squirrels and deer and raccoons?
Well, the squirrels probably are a major problem in the urban areas. In our orchard, we're up in the country and it's out in the open. We have enough hawk activity that squirrels really don't come into our orchard because we get people at the market all the time. So what do you do for squirrels? And I said, I don't worry about them. We have so many predators, they won't come out. They stay back in the woods area. Now, in a residential setup, what I would do is just stay on top of your fruit. When the Diosporus, and his khaki is the genus on that. When you see it start to show a yellow color to it, and it doesn't have to turn orange, but just that yellow color, you can harvest it. And we will take those, if we want to hold them, we'll put them in our cooler, which we hold at 31 degrees Fahrenheit, because fruit with the sugars in there won't freeze the fruit. but it slows down respiration. Well, that way we can hold those for a fair amount of time. When we're ready to go to market, we will pull them out of the cooler, and we just put them at usually around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere it could be even up to 70. And what it will do is the fruit will go from that light yellow, and it will start to darken up in color and soften, and the sugars will increase in that. And so you can almost stage it for when it goes to market. So usually we'll take it to market when they're orange, because most people associate that with ripeness. And I'm telling them, yeah, okay, that's fine. That's good. If you get it when it's light or yellow, we tell them just be patient, take it home with you, put it out on your counter, and just let it sit. If you want to speed it up, you could take a paper bag and put a apple in there. The ethylene given off by the apple would maturate fruit faster. Okay, you just put the bag around it, hold the ethylene around there. Um, so that's about it. So you can pick it early, and if you pick it early, then the squirrels are going to leave it alone. Once it turns orange on the tree, and it's nice to ripen on the tree, and it looks really attractive. Trouble is,
Hmm.
you are going to attract in all those animals that love to feed on it. And one you didn't mention, and it's a big deal this year. We can tell from the entomology end, is the European hornet.
Mm.
European hornets are the big black and yellow hornets. They came in from Europe back in the mid 1800s. They were brought in on shipping, and they've pretty much established all across the United States now. This year, for some reason, they're extremely active, or have been in September and October. And if they find a persimmon that is going to orange color, I guarantee they will go over and start chewing into that fruit, because they're picking up the sugars out of there, and they're going to want to harvest it. And you can still get your fruit out of there, but you're going to be fighting that hornet to get the fruit. So I would pick it when it's got the yellow color, and then ripen it inside. Do it that way. That's the best way to go on that.
Hmm. And any foliar diseases or other issues that persimmons might need to be sprayed for?
Yeah, it depends on the season. In 2018 and 2019, basically in 2018, it rained the whole year from March until October. With that was the year we had over 100 inches of rain, which set a new record. And in 2019, it basically rained from March until July, and then the rain turned off. And then we went to California dry weather. So in those years, if you did not spray with a fungicide preventatively, your fruit really didn't look very attractive. It had a lot of spots on it. There's several different leaf spotting fungi scabs that will show up on those. Now, if you have a dry year, a relatively dry year, I should put it that way, where and by July, I mean, say mid June, July, August, if it's not raining a whole lot, then you probably can get by and not have to really treat a Oriental persimmon. But in a wet, this year was rather wet this summer. If you didn't, I do independent consulting for growers down in Northern Virginia, and I was down to visit some of theirs. They look beautiful in the season. They chose not to use any fungicides on there. And when I last visited about a month ago, the fruit looked awful. I mean, it had
Mm.
spots all over it. They were planning to cut around those, and I said, "But you're not going to sell those commercially. There's no one's going to want the fruit." Now, the native persimmon is much more adapted to our climate, because that evolved over time to exist here. It it can show spotting on the skin, but usually when it wrinkles down, by the time you're harvesting it, you really don't notice it anymore. It looks so gosh awful anyhow that it's still quite usable and would go into the marketplace. But the Oriental types, because of that firm skin, especially Guang Yang or the Giro, it would be very noticeable, and most people would find it objectionable. So you'd have to use some fungicides during those wet periods. Now, is there a schedule of that? Now, you really, in a commercial orchard, we go by spore counts. They have things that are done up at Penn State at the Bigler Experiment Station, where they'll take spore counts. When we see they're high, then you use a preventative fungicide at that point. Short residual materials, but it has to be preventative.
And for planting around the persimmon
Mhm.
trees, are they like other fruit trees that don't like anything in their root zone, or can you intermingle things there?
Yeah, I wouldn't intermingle anything with a persimmon. And they do have a tendency to try and sucker shoot out of the base. So you might have to take out some of those sucker shoots and remove those. Most of the Oriental types, like the Guangyang or Jiro or any of those others, are grafted either on a Japanese understock or they're put on the American persimmon understock. And so if it tries to grow from down near the base and it's coming out of that understock, you definitely want to cut that off because you won't get the fruit that you bought that you wanted.
Hmm. Yeah, you would be getting whatever that.
Whatever the understock was. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of the Japanese understocks, remember I mentioned earlier about straying away from Bill Preston's wise advice of only using Guangyang.
Hmm.
Some of those ones I got that winter killed, they killed the top, but the root systems are still very hardy. And they were Japanese understocks. And
Mm.
I let them grow up to see what they did. They're small little dinky fruit that tastes terrible, and they're very ornamental. If you just wanted to grow them as an ornamental, they'd be fine. But they really didn't taste very good. It's just not a worthwhile plant. So I ended up taking those out completely.
So, how do you use your persimmons that you eat? Do you make preserves? Do you make pie? What's your favorite way to prepare them?
I wish I could tell you that because uh, we sell ours at markets. We sell them at the farm markets and sell them to caterers and restaurants. So far we've never had an excess of them to use them. My wife makes jams out of just about all the other fruits we grow, and my gosh, we have so many different things we grow at that orchard. And she tries to sneak away some of those persimmons from me to make jams, and I always throw them back into the bin to sell them because the demand's so strong on them. So we haven't had a chance to make them into anything. Now, Bill Preston years ago with Jim Shanks held something at there's a place called the Old Mill, which is right in Prince George's County, right in the Montgomery County border, on Old Branch Creek. And they held something called the Persimmon Festival. And every year they made persimmon ice cream, they made persimmon cakes, they made persimmon cookies, they made persimmon pudding. Everything was about persimmons. And it was very fun. I got to try all those. They all taste wonderful. So you can use it for a lot of different things, yes. But jams, I would say they'd be marvelous at. We were selling to one of the high-end restaurants in Baltimore for a number of years, and they did not want our Oriental ones. They wanted only native persimmons, which was wonderful because we had freebies already grown at our orchard. So all I'd do was go up the trees and cut those off and sell them to them. And I asked them what they were doing with it, and they were making them into to jams, and they would sell them at their high-end restaurant. And the jams were between $15 to $20 for a little 4-ounce jam jar. So they definitely had value added to them. It had a wonderful flavor to it. I'm sure with everybody using beer, with everything, with pawpaws in it and all the sort, you could probably put persimmon in a beer, I guess, if you really wanted to.
Yeah, I can see it like a persimmon hard cider mix, like we talked
There you
about
go.
hard cider before, or maybe persimmon wine.
Oh yeah, lots of things you could do with it.
Yeah, but that persimmon ice cream that you mentioned and that persimmon festival, wow, I'm sorry I missed that.
Yeah. Well, we need to probably revive it. We need to find a grower with enough plants to. I'm trying to
Mhm.
increase our number of trees at our place. We have maybe about 12 at this point, but we're trying to increase the number because demand is so strong for these
Mhm.
Oriental persimmons.
Yeah, I think maybe between you and the Preston Orchards and
Yeah,
maybe some others, we can probably get that back again someday.
hopefully.
And so, some other fruit that's coming into ripening right now, you had mentioned before we went on the air the Shea fruit or Che fruit, the melon fruit.
Yes. Well, it's CHE is the
Hmm.
spelling on that. Now, depends on where you're from. I've mentioned to someone who was just out to my orchard from China, and I called it Shea fruit, and she called it she fruit. And I said, I haven't heard that pronunciation. She said, well, she's from the central part of China. She said that's how they would say it. The CHE in Chinese translates to stone, and evidently this fruit tree is found grown in stony soil and rocky soil, so it's very adaptable. It's from China, and it's an interesting fruit tree. When people come out to my orchard at this time of year, it catches their attention in October, November. it's a relatively small tree. It's maybe tops out at around 12 feet, just like the Oriental Persimmon. But the fruit on it looks very much like a Cornus cusa. In a sense, it looks like the human brain. And it's
Hmm.
about the size of a 50-cent piece.
Hmm.
And it's green most of the summer. But as soon as it gets cooler in about mid October, you'll see it turn pink color. And then as it gets colder in the later part of the month, it turns bright, bright red. We've taken it down in the market, and everybody that walks over there says, "I'll take a container of your big raspberries there." And I look around and what raspberries are you talking about? They're pointing to the Shea Fruit. And I said, "Oh, no, 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 that's called Shea Fruit." And they said, "Well, does it taste like a raspberry?" And usually we'll tell them, try a sample of it, take the whole fruit, bite into it. And I say to them, tell me what you think that flavor is. And 95% of the time I will hear it tastes like watermelon or cantaloupe. And I said, well, that's good because its name in the United States is melon fruit. So it's a very unusual fruit, very late in the season. Now, if someone's growing in their backyard and they don't want to do a lot of spraying, that's the fruit for them. It's ideal. We do not treat that with anything, and I haven't seen any pest on it. We've been growing it since 2002 out there. It's a relatively pest-free fruit. I have not had deer feed on it. I've not had raccoons go after it. And you harvest. We will be harvesting the last time this weekend. That will make the fifth weekend we've harvested off those trees. Now, there is male and female trees, so generally you need one male, and then we have a couple females. They graft it, kind of interesting, onto a native plant here that we have here called the Osage Orange. Okay,
Huh.
now, now Osage Orange is
Yeah.
a very vigorous tree, and it has such a aggressive root system that for some reason that they've chosen to graft it onto that rootstock, so it's more tolerant of soils. So you do need to watch if you see something coming out of the base, because Osage Orange will have the branches have thorns on them, and so you have to take those sucker shoots out of there. Otherwise, you'll be dealing with some nasty little thorns coming out of the understock part. But the tree itself, the shea, is basically thornless. It's a fun fruit on there. If you go to Edible Landscape down in Purcellville, Virginia, they several years ago started offering a seedless, what they're calling a seedless variety of it. It has small little seeds in it, a little bit like a raspberry seed. The seedless one doesn't have as many of those little seeds, but you only need one tree. You only need a female. You don't. It's self fertile. And we started growing those. What I found is they're not as vigorous as the ones where you need a male and female, and they're slower growing. It's going to take you 6 or 7 years before it really comes into production for the seedless version. But if you're patient, you can get by with just one. The new ones I'm planting, I've only put in the seedless ones in other parts of the orchard where I don't have to rely on a male. But we still just keep the one male around for our pollen source. But a
Hmm.
fun fruit to grow, relatively, if you want to get by without doing a lot of spraying with fungicides or insecticides, it's a good plant to play around with. But it comes very late in the season.
Hmm. And for those podcast listeners, you might recall that we had Mike McConkey of Edible Landscaping on episode 22. So that was August of 2020. And go back and listen to that episode for some more tips on great fruit trees for the mid-Atlantic. And I think we might have touched on the shea, but I don't think we went into it that much. So that's great to hear about it, especially since it's a fall timing fruit. And another one you said you're growing that is coming into ripening now is the beech plum.
Well, beech plum, we go over that briefly, and it's one of the one I want to do was the citrus too. After that, if we could, but beech plum is a
Hmm.
native plum, and it's not this time of year. It was a little bit earlier. Plums generally they ripen. Most of the varieties will ripen in July and August. Beech plums start to ripen end of August, and they pretty much go through the whole month of September. Um, they're native to the East Coast. You can find them from Maine all the way down to Georgia in some of the coastal areas. You don't find it in Maryland though, and there's a good reason. Our beach that we have is Ocean City, Maryland. Well, that was
Hmm.
created by a hurricane,
Ah.
and the beach plums never got established there. And the place that they would be growing would be Azatec Island. But what do we have on Azatec Island?
Got all those wild horses.
There you go. And
Yeah.
they've eaten all the beach plums down the ground, so they love them, and also deer love them. Also, they love beach plums. But if you're from New England, you would know that fruit. It usually after Labor Day, people go back into the dunes, and it grows as a almost a small tree or shrub, and they would harvest the beach plums. Now they're small; they're only about the size of a big blueberry, and they have a big hard seed pit in them, and they're tart. And you think, well, why would anybody grow that? Well, people from New England would harvest them, and then they would put them in things like nylon hose or whatever, some sort of net bag, and boil them in water, and they would make jellies out of them, and it makes a wonderful, wonderful jelly. Now, one of my cohorts in the university system was working on his doctorate at Cornell University. His name is Dr. Richard Uva, and Richard actually took these wild species and looked at cultivating them and selecting for bigger size and different colors on those. Then they now have the patent through Cornell on several name varieties. There's things like Premier and Hancock. They have a yellow gold. That's a yellow color beach plum. What's nice is they're adapted to the East Coast climate. So they're much more disease tolerant than a lot of the European plums that we try and grow in backyards or Oriental types. So it's a nice one to be growing in the landscape. Now, again, my job is working with the nursery and greenhouse industry, state of Maryland, and repeatedly I've shown nurserymen this is an interesting plant. It's not really sold in the nursery trade, but I was telling them they need to look at it because it has beautiful flower display. It flowers a lot later than any of the other plums. Other plums would be well done, and then about 2 weeks later, these things open up their blooms. It covers itself with white flowers. It is gorgeous when it's in bloom. And then the little plums that form in there are green color during the summer. And then in the fall, they color up. They're kind of bluish purple. Again, even if you weren't harvesting it to eat it, it's an extremely attractive tree, and I just haven't had any nurserymen jump on this thing yet. So it's just kind of a box that just hasn't been opened up yet. The cultivated varieties, the Hancock and the Premier, will give you a fruit that's about the size of between a dime and a nickel in size, and so it still has a pit in the center. It is a little tartar plum than most people are used to. You're used to the Oriental types, the round ones, and the European types they call prune plums. Those are extremely sweet. This is a much tartar flavor. Now, when we first brought it into our farm market, most Americans, when we let them sample it, thought they were blueberries. Number one, they thought they were big blueberries. And we said, no, be careful. It's got a pit in the center. But when they pop it in their mouth, they're thinking really sweet. And they get a funny look on their face. But we have many of our clientele are from Europe, especially northern part of Europe. And they tend not to be raised on sugar like most Americans here. I mean, from the get go, we're given sugary drinks and soft drinks and sodas and everything, and milkshakes. That's not as doesn't occur as much in the northern part of Europe. So they like that tartar flavor. So we've developed a very big clientele now for this native plum that has kind of a tart flavor. And if you let it go really long, it actually does get sweeter if you let it a little bit, hang on that plant a little bit longer. It is small, and you have to get the idea a smaller plum, but it's much more disease tolerant than our other plums that you'd be trying to grow in your backyard. It is self-fertile, so you just need the one variety on the thing. I would get the name varieties. Premier and Ozark are or Hancock, excuse me. Hancock are two good ones. They have a gold one that's also available. You'll have to search around to find them. If you get the straight species, they're going to be a smaller thing. They're only going to be about the size of a blueberry, which is still okay. If it's just an ornamental, that'd be fine. And if you're going to make just jams out of it, that'd work fine for you. But if you're going for that fruit production, I'd get those name varieties.
Hmm. Well, I definitely have to look out for them. And so, with our last few minutes left, we definitely wanted to touch on that cold hardy citrus that you are experimenting with.
I'm very excited about those. The one of my the night I teach at Montgomery College, and one of my students introduced me to varieties of citrus that were more cold hardy. As I looked into it, there's some of the varieties you can find out there that can take it down to the low teens. Then I found some that would go below 10 degrees, and now we found some varieties that can take it down to 1 degree Fahrenheit. I even have a lemon that came through the polar vortex at 8 below for 3 days in a row and survived. And I have that one. It's called Julie. It's not commonly found. It's just something that I've selected. But you can find some of these hardy citruses if you do a search on the web. There's one called Citrange, and Citrange is a very nice orange, very sweet flavor that can take it down into the single digit figures and do okay. We've been growing them in big pots, and we will keep them out until about Thanksgiving. Then we bring them inside for the winter and just keep them in sunny windows through the usually end of March, and then they go back outside again and grow them outside. This year, I'm beginning to play with that lemon that I have that took it 8 below, and we're going to try some of the citranes and one of the oranges called Morton's orange that's down to 1 degree Fahrenheit. And we planted them in Westminster at our orchard. We're going to see how they ride through this winter. I think we have some potential here. I've seen plantings down in Virginia Beach of the Mortons and the Citrange, and it came through the polar vortex. Got a little bit of damage on the foliage, but the fruit seemed to do pretty well. So we might have some citrus that looks adaptable for Maryland, possibly.
Hmm. Yeah, that's going to be really fascinating to follow up on in a few years.
Yeah.
And do you think, we're talked a little bit about climate change and the extremes that we're going to get, the
Yeah.
extreme highs and lows, and how that might impact some of that fruit tree growing in our region?
Yeah, well, the last two winters have been relatively mild, and about everybody growing figs. I know we weren't going to get on figs too much, but the
Hmm.
figs have done very well. We had many people come to the market saying, "Oh, their fig trees look wonderful. They're producing well." And I said, "Yeah, you had two mild winters,
Hmm.
and we can get stretches like this where we have a couple years where it's very mild winters, and some of these marginal varieties will do very, very well. But realize we are in a climate change thing where it's more extreme. So it may be mild for a couple winters, but then probably we're going to swing back and get a violent period in between. So you might have to protect things on those real extreme years, and there's ways of doing that. Figs, they've done them in Wisconsin, where they actually dig a trench next to the plant, they bundle the branches together and bend them down to the ground and bury it. Now, once you bury it down like that and put soil over it, weight it down, the roots are hardy to 40 below, and the stems can take it quite cold when they're covered up like that. We've done some trials with one of our people that were growing figs where they bend the branches of the ground, we put carpet over top of it, and then weighted that down. And that rode through those extreme periods of the polar vortex and the polar express and didn't have the damage. Whereas you had the stems above ground, you will see the damage on
That is a lot of effort, I must say.
them. It is, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I would say that is, especially if you have one that you particularly love that flavor of that
Yes.
particular variety and that you've really babied it along, you want to go to that extra effort.
Yeah. Where there's the will, there's the way. There's if I can do a short advertisement, there's a course that
Hmm.
I teach at Montgomery College. I just taught it this last spring called Advanced Fruit Production. It's only offered every 2 years. So that would be offered in uh, 2023 if people do want to go further with fruit production and learn all the in-depth things of all the unusual fruit you can grow. I would say sign up for the course. Right now, we're doing it online since the COVID came out, and we've
Hmm.
increased our enrollment tremendously with that. Before it used to be all live, and I think we'll probably go back to hybrids where it's between online and live.
Great. And how would people be able to contact you, Stanton?
The way, if you want to contact me, would be come to our farm market. We're at the Alney Market on Sundays from 9 o'clock to 1. You're certainly welcome to visit there and purchase fruit, and we'll have some of the trees we sell there. during the day, you really can't get me because my job is working with the commercial nursery and greenhouse industry in the state, not with the
Hmm.
homeowners. But you can go through Home and Garden Information Center that are set up to deal with the homeowner questions.
Great. And for those who are listening outside the Mid-Atlantic area, Stanton is talking about the Olney, Maryland market in Montgomery County, Maryland. So if you're ever in the Washington, D.C. area, come on by and visit him there. And again, you can contact him through the University of Maryland Extension office as well. So thank you so much, Stanton, for talking all about persimmons and some of the more unusual fruits. And maybe in a few years, we'll have you back to talk about hardy citrus that is going to overwinter for us here in the Mid-Atlantic.
All right, good. All right.
Thank you so much. Cutting lettuce plant profile. Cutting lettuce, also known as cut and come again lettuce, are salad greens grown for their leaves rather than to develop a head. Cutting leaves come in red and green varieties as well as several combinations of the two colors. The leaves can be flat, ruffled, or curly. Lettuce greens are a cool season crop and do best in the spring and fall here in the Mid-Atlantic United States. When the summer heat moves in, the plants bolt and send up a flower shoot that produces seeds. You can collect these seeds to plant the next season. Note that lettuce seed must be fresh in order for it to have good germination rates. The seeds are tiny and can be planted directly into the garden soil or in a shallow container. Cover them with a fine layer of soil and water in well. Lettuce prefers rich garden soil and does not need fertilizers. For continual harvests, you can sow additional rows of lettuce seeds every week or two. When the plants are several inches high, use a clean pair of kitchen shears to cut off the largest leaves down to an inch or so above the root crown. Harvest only as much as you will consume right away. In a few weeks, these lettuces will grow back up again, and you will be able to come for another round of cutting. Depending on the length of your growing season, you can usually get at least 3 or 4 rounds of cut greens from the plants. Slugs and rabbits love tender lettuce leaves, as do many other garden pests. You can protect your lettuce seedlings with a wire cage or a cover cloth. The cloth can also act to shade the tender leaves as the weather heats up in the late spring and insulates the plants when the autumn frosts move in. Cutting lettuce, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, it happened. The DC area got zapped by a frost and a freeze, and it looks like it's officially the end for the tomatoes and peppers and annual flowers. My pond plants that are floating on the surface haven't got too much of a black edge, but I'll probably pull them out this weekend in any case. So I'm applying straw around my asparagus and strawberries and other perennial plants in our community garden plot. I've also put row cover fabric over the lettuce, spinach, radish, and bok choy to insulate them for the wintertime. We still haven't put in our garlic, but that's our plan for this upcoming week. And I've started collecting seeds from those annual flowers that I'm pulling. So some of those favorite zinnias and cosmos I grew this year, I'm definitely going to be setting aside in a special envelope to plant again next year. In the local gardening world, there's a couple events I want to draw your attention to. First is the Silver Spring Garden Club Veterans Day planting of daffodil bulbs at Jessup Blair Park, and that is on the DC Maryland border, right on Georgia Avenue near Eastern Avenue. And we do that at 11 a.m. It's open to guests and anybody who wants to plant daffodils with us. We welcome donations as well. We have about 750 bulbs we're putting in this year that will be added to the several thousand bulbs we put in over the last 5 to 6 years at that park. So it's going to be a beautiful springtime there. Also happening is a fall colors talk that I am giving for the Sandy Spring Museum Garden Club. This event is being held virtually, and it's on Sunday, November 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can sign up for it through the sandyspringmuseum.org website. And our insect columnist for Washington Gardener magazine is giving an upcoming talk at Brookside Gardens, and that is entitled Horticulture Fact and Fiction, Debunking Gardening Myths. So that should be a fascinating one. And if you've been a past listener of GardenDC podcast, she has been one of our past guests talking about orchids and also addressing some of those gardening myths. So that's Carol Allen. She's a faculty member at the Plant Sciences Department at University of Maryland. There's a nominal fee to sign up for this talk, and it is being held virtually, so you can sign up and do it live or get the recording afterwards, and that is on Thursday, November 18th at 6:30 p.m., and you can sign up for that through the Active Montgomery website. Happy gardening! Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.com. Thank you. You can find Washington Gardener online at washingtongardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.